Made with love by Integral.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Integral, and we're very, very honored and pleased to have Dr. Anjali Ferguson and Dr. Jennifer Noble here with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you again to Indigo for having me. I am Dr. Anjali Ferguson. I am a clinical psychologist with expertise in early childhood mental health and trauma-informed, culturally responsive care. I am also the founder of Parenting Culture, which is a resource that is intended to kind of bridge these gaps around diversity and equity conversations with our kiddos, our families, and beyond, really.
So I am Dr. Jennifer Noble. I am also a clinical psychologist. I have a private practice here in Los Angeles, and I tend to work with people of color, marginalized populations, and one of my focal areas is mixed race. And then outside of my private practice, I have been doing a lot of work with parents of mixed race kids specifically to help them sort of understand the mixed race experience, learn the tips and tricks on how to be present for an experience that their child is going to have.
Thank you very much. So today we wanted to spend time talking about raising kids in an increasingly diverse world and pieces of the puzzle that parents are missing, irrespective of whether you're raising a mixed race kid or not. The environment is more diverse. I think kids are facing multicultural interactions far earlier. Why do you think it's not top of mind for parents? And what are like the top 2 or 3 things that parents can do?
I think, to be fair to parents, it's not top of mind because they have a whole bunch of other stuff to worry about in raising a small one, like schools and are you sick? There's so many general aspects of enriching a child's life that I think parents get pulled into. And so then it starts to feel like, oh, race, ethnicity stuff, we don't need to focus on that. They'll get that just by virtue of living in our home. That's the only, dare I say, mistake that then gets made, is the parents kind of thinking, oh, I don't need to actually verbalize and talk about this because it's already present and they'll just absorb it on their own. And that's just not really what happens. Kids will absorb it, but they'll be absorbing their own messaging and trying to figure out what they are seeing around them. Helping your child understand that they are a member of a particular group and what comes along with that, so they can start just embracing, oh, okay, I am a member of this larger group. What are they about? Versus just living in a home and thinking, oh, that's just the way grandma is, and that's just the way grandpa does things, and I don't really know why. I haven't really put it together. So that top reason would be really giving them a chance to understand, okay, this is a part of me, and now I can start navigating that for myself. When that kid starts to go to school, they are going to have people questioning and asking and wondering, like you said, whether they are mixed race or not. If it's a school environment where they don't have many kids from the group that the kid is from, they're going to get questions. And so if nothing else, we want that kid to be prepared and have answers to give those kids, rather than feeling small and insecure and worried and what do you mean, and feeling ostracized and alienated. I think that's where the power comes in with parents having these small conversations.
Embracing identity and sort of empowering them with the confidence of who they are and where they come from, being comfortable in their own skin as well. Yeah. So Anjali, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think to the point of us living in this multicultural environment that's growingly diverse, I think we have the internet to thank for a lot of that. Our kiddos are being exposed to different groups, different folks much sooner than maybe we grew up being exposed to. And I think a part of why parents don't have identity conversations at top of mind is the basic needs, like Dr. Jen mentioned. As a mom myself, yes, most days I am focused on making sure there's enough sleep and food and all of that being had. But then the other side of it for my little guy is what becomes really important for me is this idea of socialization, right? And what that means is just that we are interacting with folks that look like us and think like us, but also with groups that are different from us. And that is happening more naturally. And also we have to be very intentional of how we do that as parents, because I don't think we understand that importance and how connected that is to identity development, which then impacts mental health as kiddos grow and learn and interact with their environment. So if we can lay foundations at home, then we can help protect that identity development and give kids the safe spaces to navigate these discussions. My kiddo, I'm South Asian. I've lived in India for a little bit of my life, but most of my time has been spent in the Northeast and the DC area. So I've grown up in very, very different environments. And my husband is Black and he's from the Pittsburgh area, which is also very different from DC. And we learned that in our interactions and our conversations. And those are really prominent. Both cultures are really prominent in our household because we're so intentional about it. And my kid's only 2, right? And I think why we're so intentional about it is we know that pride, cultural pride, is such a big protective factor and such a big buffer. And kids actually do notice race-based differences and want language to it really early in development. About 6 months of age, kids can notice race-based differences. And by 2 to 4, they've developed racial biases. So if we're not giving language, we're not giving opportunities for interaction, we're doing them a disservice, really. Because it is developmentally just appropriate for us to categorize in our mind and try and make sense of what's going on, right? Just like how we teach kids what big versus little is, or tall versus short is. Kids want to know why mommy's skin color looks different from daddy's skin color. They just want to understand it. And it's coming from a place of understanding and knowledge building. And then the other piece I will add is what I like to do when I talk with the families I work with, or even when I'm thinking about my own son, is normalizing differences, right? I mean, there's 3 of us here. We're all, we identify as cisgender women, but we all still have so many differences. And our differences are what make us unique. And the likelihood that you're going to come across somebody who's different from you is very high. Every person is different from you. And I think normalizing the difference makes it less scary for us to have those conversations too.
You mentioned just now that your kid's only 2. So I'm going to come back and ask you, how early is early and how late is late when you have these conversations? When do you start and how do you start?
I mean, I am a firm believer that it's never too early. And, you know, I'm not sitting my 2-year-old down and saying, listen, you are mixed race, right? He's not going to understand that. We do that with the media that he's exposed to, how we celebrate our holidays and what holidays we celebrate and prioritize, different types of food we eat. We want him to have access to that and talk about it, right? And we talk about different, like he knows what a laddu is versus also loving collard greens for Thanksgiving time, right? And that's just his house. And we want pride around all of that. And in his books that he reads, the different toys that he has, the TV shows that we expose him to show a range of our cultures, our backgrounds, and other people. So we're very intense, like gender diversity, linguistic diversity. He loves reggaeton music, so he's been exposed to like Spanish speaking populations for a really long time. That's socialization, right? And as he gets older, he goes through normal periods of identity development, which happen for kids usually around 4 to 6, then again in adolescence, then again in young adulthood. There's going to be other questions that come up because he's going to say, how do these aspects of home, how do these aspects of mom versus dad impact me? What does that mean for me, Jay? And I want him to have an environment when he hits those periods of questioning, and he's like, Mommy, what about me? How do I fit into this? Where he can come to me and talk to me about it, and we can figure that out together, right? So it's never too early. It's also never too late. And you can always, I know I continue to develop my own cultural identity well into adulthood. And there were different aspects of my South Asian heritage that I avoided and pushed away. And it took me a very long time to kind of grapple with what about being a South Asian woman. I want it to be a part of me, right? And it can continue to be a process your whole life, really. So just keeping the conversations open and knowing it's fluid, doesn't ever end. That's the biggest thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Dr. Jen, as you coach parents with regards to this topic, do you encourage them to start at a particular age? Or do you have any sort of watch out signals or triggers or barriers for parents? Like what would you say is a good time to start?
I fully co-sign everything Dr. Anjali said, because there's never too early. I think there are so many more subtle ways to approach this conversation. I think perhaps maybe are thinking, kind of like you were joking, like they have to sit down and be like, race relations today in the world. Like, no, you're not going to have an intellectual discussion about the pain and heartache that all these groups have gone through. You are giving them something that is a part of them in a more tangible, age appropriate way. And there's so many lovely books that help parents do that. So even if a parent is like, I don't even know where to start, I don't know what to say, I always say, let's just start with a few straightforward books, because someone already thought about it for you. And that very well could be a book that a kid says, "Well, read that again. Can you read it again?" If you read it 4 times in a row because it meant something to that kid and they resonated in some way with it. And then they can start to use that language in their everyday life, and the parents can too. So maybe if there's some book about making a cake and all the different ingredients that go into a cake, they're all important and they make the cake taste a certain way, you can help that kid start to understand, oh, okay, I'm made up of multiple ingredients and they're all very important. Not one is more important than the other. And then during the day, they can start to use phrasing like that. And the parent can be like, yeah, cake. Okay, we're going to use that analogy for a while. So it's lovely how books can help with that. But I would say, just as you sort of said, when would be the age? If there's no particular age that I would recommend, I would say whenever the kid brings it up, and they're going to bring it up. So that could be as young as 3. That kid could start to say, how come this? And why do you look like that, parent? And why did Uncle so-and-so say this? Whatever the situation is. But especially, like I said, when preschool or playing with other kids gets involved, that is always the opportunity, even if you don't think the kid was impacted by it, to revisit that situation. Oh, we went to the playground. Remember that lady said, is that your kid? What did you think about that? Do you remember that happening? Let's talk about it. Let's read a book about it. Let's really start to help you understand that people are going to keep asking these types of questions. You don't have to be confused. You don't have to feel bad. And don't worry. I, as your parent, I've got your back. We're going to be dealing with this together. Usually there is always an incident that a parent notices their kid asking, but then they just sort of hope, like, maybe I don't really need to talk about it. Maybe it'll go away. Maybe it was just an innocent question. Now is the time. If you didn't do it yet, now for sure.
Human nature is to gravitate towards your comfort zones. Now, what happens is that your kid sort of starts looking at that insular world. And I know many communities, whether it's in Singapore, whether it's in London, or whether it's in Cape Town, where, everyone lives in their own silo. You're also doing your child a disservice, whether that's something that can change in society intentionally, of having play dates that are a little bit more intentional, or forming groups and communities that are a little bit intentional. So what are your thoughts around that? Is that idealistic thinking, or is that something that, it's achievable as a society?
I personally think it's achievable. I think intentional, is the key word in all of this. I think you may have your standard group or community that you go to for the most part, but the piece of being intentional means, all right, let me add to this rather than just let me relax into this and never add anything to it. I know my child is going to need to see more, be exposed to more. So how am I going to create that for them? You don't have to give up all your friends and find some sort of multicultural community and, but you can say, all right, what are some things that I know would be helpful? Is there some sort of extracurricular activity or some community service organization that we can get involved in where my kid by default will be exposed to one or more cultural groups. As long as it's something that becomes a routine, then that kid is getting some outside exposure. I just think intentional for me would be the key word in all of that.
Yeah. Dr. Anjali?
Yeah, I mean, I second Dr. Jen, but the intentionality is key. I think that's the aspirational goal, is for us to be able to like socialize and integrate our communities more, because in reality, socialization actually solidifies identity more. So the more that we are exposed to not only our culture, but different cultures, help us become more firm in who we are, right? So it sounds counter, but it's how it works, because then we're seeing different things, we're pulling from different cultures and figuring out this is me. When we don't do the exposure, then you build like fear and anxiety about other, and that's where you get things like discrimination and prejudice and stereotypes, right? And if we want to build or raise kids who are empathic and kind, exposure to differences is just critical. I thought of when I finally like got my parents to meet my husband, which if you're from the South Asian community, you know how tough that is to meet somebody outside of the South Asian community, and then a Black man on top of it. My mom's biggest fear was, she said to me, and I'll never forget these words, but she was like, but we're going to have to learn a whole new culture. And I was like, yeah, and actually that's okay. And also, you guys are really similar. Like his parents and my parents are very similar, but the fear of otherness, you know, kind of was a barrier for my family to even think of considering moving forward, right? And that fear hung on until they met them, and then they were like besties, right? And I think that's what exposure does. That's what integration does. That's what socialization does. And it's really the adults who have that anxiety that we're kind of projecting onto our kids.
Yeah.
You know, our kids are curious. They don't know any different. And they just want to learn. And it really is as simple as adults finding the time and opportunities. Even now, summer's coming around here in the United States. So in our city, we have a lot of community organizations and block parties and festivals, right? Checking out festivals and trying foods even from other groups is such an easy way that you can be intentional about scheduling it in with your family and then talking about it, right? Like, oh, this grape leaf reminds me of this dish in Indian food. Do you see the similarities? Did you like it? Oh, it's okay. Let's try something else, right? Like, and again, normalizing and avoiding judgment of others too. And when I say judgment, that means like negative adjectives to describe another group, because that's their culture. We can embrace it and experience it, but saying, oh, yuck, or gross, or that's not for me, that's judgment, right? But you can just be present and aware and experience it. And then you can just try other things if it doesn't work out for you too, right? Just that openness to experience, I think, is really, really critical for our kiddos.
Okay, that's very, very helpful, also insightful. And I often find that people focus a lot on differences. And by the way, that's really beautiful. But sometimes you forget to focus on the similarities. And actually, kids pick that up. They're like, I had this and he had this, but this is different in this way. But actually, it's really similar like that. And often as adults, we forget to make the connection because we've separated it in our brains. But actually, kids make the connection themselves. I'd love to end with like your last piece of advice for parents who are raising multicultural kids, who are raising mixed race kids, or who are just raising kids in this more global, more connected world.
The one thing I would want to leave parents with is exposure, exposure, exposure. Any and all the ways that you can find to expose your kid to a variety of cultural experiences, some that are related to who they are, but also to just other cultures in the world. I think there's no way you can go wrong with that, because it will inevitably, it'll spark questions that then you can talk with them about. It'll solidify some understanding of themselves. It'll help them understand their family. It'll give them words to use when other peers want to question them. So exposure from the smallest to the biggest way that you can think of.
I agree with exposure, and I would also add in openness, right? Yourself openness, because I know that I've only had my son for 2 years. I've been doing parenting work for over a decade and a half, but in these last 2 years, I have learned so much through him and the intentionality that comes with wanting to raise a multicultural, multiracial child, right, in this world. So that openness to learning and openness to being challenged yourself as a parent, to sit in some of that discomfort too that comes with this. Because again, we did not have a guide growing up. So we are trying to change that now, right? And we're trying to have conversations that hopefully impact the next generation. And with that change comes discomfort. So being okay with that too.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. Hopefully, this has helped our community from all over the world put together a few pieces of this puzzle. And while we know that parenting is filled with moments of everyday hardship as well, it's also fulfilling. And hopefully, this will add a little bit of an extra piece to their parenting journey, a much needed one in today's world. So appreciate both your thoughts. Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed this video. Visit us at integralkids.com for more.